All right, hey there, y'all. Sorry it's been so long. I am back in Lubbock, not enjoying the weather as much. We're going to be starting Unit 3 here, so don't forget that tomorrow, Tuesday, July 23rd, is the last day to turn in the paper. I will do my best to get all your grades turned around Wednesday morning. And then we're going to be starting Unit 3, which is largely a sort of a critique section, right? So we're going to start out with a critique from Karl Marx from the 19th century about industrialization and urbanization. And then we're going to talk about three civil rights advocates throughout American history. So we'll start with Frederick Douglass, who was a former slave in Maryland, from what I remember, and as sort of a perspective before the Civil War. And then we will also discuss the two main civil rights leaders, at least in the United States, in the 1960s, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., who both had wildly differing views about how to approach the government and society about opening up full political rights. Okay, so, excuse me, we will begin with the Communist Manifesto. I suggest that you read the whole thing. Chapters 3 and 4 are really very interesting sort of notes about the evolution of the Communist Party, how the Communist Party relates to former communist slash socialist philosophies, etc. So, anyway, let's dive in. So, first of all, some context. This is the early 19th century. We have seen the establishment of America. We have seen the massive rise of trade. Hey, I need to plug in my. So we've seen, the establishment of America. We've seen the massive rise of sort of international trade through the shipping industry. We are seeing industrialization, right, and the horrors that industrialization brought, at least for laborers. And we're seeing urbanization, all of these upheavals in society um, around the sort of middle of the 19th century. And so there have been a lot of talk about communism, socialism, the power of laborers, etc. And as Karl Marx and Engels point out in their introduction, um, the elites and the governments all across European societies were sort of using communism as a boogeyman, right, to just delegitimize their opposition. So Marx and Engels said, okay, we want to formalize this and, in a succinct way, be able to spread a pamphlet that tells people what the Communist Party is and what the philosophy of the Communist Party is. Okay, so chapter 1, the bourgeois and the proletarians. Uh, Basically, Karl Marx, similarly to Hobbes, says that all of human existence is based on class struggle, right? So Hobbes says it's all about man against man. Marx sort of takes it a step further and says, well, no, it's not man against man, it's about class, right? Like, who owns the capital and who has to sell their labor, basically. And he says that there's basically two different possibilities that can come out of this class struggle, right? The first is what he calls revolutionary reconstitution of society at large. So we get this complete upheaval, society changes. Or the second, common ruin of the contending classes. So not just the proletarians, but also the bourgeoisie in common sort of destroy themselves and their society. And he says that classes inevitably appear in human society, right? And I don't think there's really any argument about that. But he does say that under sort of the modern bourgeoisie slash proletarian system, the bourgeoisie, the people who hold all the capital and the means of production, right, are restricting society to just two classes, right? So we've we've broken out of this long history of European feudalism and the guild system, right? And because the guild system is breaking down completely due to the rise of industrialization and trade, um, then it's sort of rapidly developing this breakdown between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And so Marx goes on and he says that every time the bourgeoisie gains financial power, they also grow um, a concomitant amount of political power, right? So the larger their wealth gets, the larger their political strength becomes. And so the new system, according to Marx and Engels, of the sort of bourgeoisie proletarian split, this sort of hyper wealth, in addition to the modern democratic state, means that we get complete control of the oligarchy. So what he's saying here basically is that the democratic state is just a facade. Oh, excuse me, and that modern governance is basically simply a facade to trick the proletarians, the workers, into thinking there's a society looking out for their best interests, while it is really just an extension of the hyper wealthy, right? And he says, quote, the executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. So, the hyper wealthy own the state. And this is sort of inevitable because of the confluence of the rising bourgeoisie, the rise of inequality in our societies, and the democratic nature and the easiness, the ease of buying off politicians. Excuse me. So Marx and Engels go on to suggest that money, in and of itself, basically the global financial system, incentivizes the bourgeoisie to destroy the current system of morals and relationships in the favor of sort of cash transaction, right? So we used to have all of these. Excuse me, darn it. Okay. Um, damn it. Okay. Okay. So Marx and Engels are basically saying that money, again, incentivizes the bourgeoisie to destroy the traditional morals and relationships in society in favor of the cash, sort of cash transaction, right? So religious institutions break down and become mere receivers of cash and dole out things like the what do they call the forgiveness? You could pay for your sins to be forgiven, basically. Um, it breaks down the relationship of the family in his suggestion, and even causes things like parents selling their kids to manufacturers as laborers, or even into prostitution and things like that. And he says, "quote It has resolved personal worth into exchange value." And he says the constant revolutionizing of production and uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. So they have to constantly be revolutionizing, um, and making more efficient, right, their production techniques, and this is constantly overthrowing the sort of the system that we live in. And I guess the modern, the very contemporary suggestion that everybody is pointing to, of course, is AI, artificial intelligence. So basically, Karl Marx and Engels go on to say that sort of this leads to the rise of corporate entities and corporations rather than sovereign entities, and that the concept of the nation state itself is being completely destroyed because these institutions, these corporations, which used to be based on national domestic markets and usually sort of state support and this, have become entirely ungovernable. And so, if you sort of look at least the modern state of affairs, there's all these tax havens, right? Like all the Caribbean islands and Swiss banks, and all of these things where the hyper wealthy are hiding their money, um, and don't really have to pay taxes like the rest of us poor schlubs. We get this what's called the race to the bottom, right, where states uh, cut regulations and give away freebies, and don't tax corporate entities in the hopes that they can sort of pull them into their state. So, like Texas and Tennessee are really famous for this, right? Offering free land, offering tax-free subsidies, offering, they'll even literally give you millions upon millions of dollars to help you build your corporation or whatever it is. And so you get this sort of race to the bottom. We also get intellectual property issues that he brings up, and that's a severe problem in our modern society, especially across international borders. We know that China is constantly stealing the West's intellectual property. And then he goes on and he says, quote, "It compels all nations on pain of extinction to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, i.e., to become bourgeois themselves." And so he's saying it's inevitable as we move um, through this period of industrialization and trade, and the bourgeoisie increases in its power and its political power and its economic power, it forces other states to participate in this game as well, right? Because of the international nature of the beast, and because companies have to try to, as much as they can, exploit cheap labor, cheap commodities, cheap, minerals and things of that sort. Um, Marx and Engels also say that the bourgeoisie tends to create imbalances through industrial production, right? So the first he brings up, of course, is urbanization and sort of the distribution, the redistribution of political power from the agrarian centers to the urban areas that take up vast amounts of political power. Uh, and he also discusses, international interdependence and dependence becomes inevitable, especially for those less developed states. Um, he says they go on to say that the bourgeoisie will basically inevitably destroy itself, right? And a lot of this is very utopian and philosophical. Um, just sort of keep that in mind. It was very prescient in many ways, but we also know that in many ways it doesn't really work. It was very utopian. So anyway, I wanted to put that aside in there. Um, okay, so basically he says that the proletarian laborers are basically just commodities under the system of industrialization and capitalism, right? And he says, quote, "Laborers who must sell themselves piecemeal are a commodity, like every other article of commerce, and are consequently exposed to all the vicissitudes of competition, to all the fluctuations of the market. Hence, the cost of production of a workman is restricted almost entirely to the means of subsistence that he requires for maintenance and for the propagation of his race." And this, we find this to be true before governments really put in sort of minimum wage laws or sort of, social safety nets, which are a lot stronger in Europe than they are in America. But nonetheless, before states really got involved in industrialization, and sort of limiting the power of industrialists. So think the Depression period. So there was like 150 years of this stuff running. Um, Before that, there just weren't any laws. I mean, you could have a person work 12 hours. It could be a 6-year old um, missing a leg, who was working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. Um, and often it was children, because children's little hands could have machinery much more easily. And so there were some truly, truly horrific things that occurred. And we also know that oftentimes there were, um, what they call collusion, right, between factory owners or sort of the bourgeoisie, according to Marx and Engels. They would get together to suppress wages, right? They would basically get them so far down that they were subsistence, and you could barely live on the amount that you ate. Excuse me, the amount you made, and yet you couldn't really say no because there was nowhere else to get a job. And so that's where many of the sort of modern economic restrictions on child labor and maximum hours and OSHA, right, the Organization for the Safety and Health Administration, all of these different things. So if you read a book called Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, it is an excruciating book to read about this poor Lithuanian family that immigrates to America in the early 20th century, around 1910, and immigrates to Chicago, where the vast majority of all meat was processed in America, right? It went from sort of Mexico and Texas through Abilene and Yorktown, Odessa, up through Lubbock, up through Oklahoma, all the way up to Chicago, basically. And this poor family, it tells you about how they get exploited and abused and manipulated. Many of them die. Some of them have to prostitute themselves to feed their kids, and so it's a really hard look. And there's also the idea that they're just throwing in rotten meat and rats and severed hands and things like this into like sausage grinders. And I mean, it was truly, truly abhorrent, some of the things that were occurring. They were filling many of the sausages up with half sawdust. And so, people were literally dying because they weren't getting enough nutrition and things of this sort. So, if anyone's interested in sort of the early industrial period before any of these rules started getting into place, I would suggest Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, who was a wonderful journalist and sort of wrote about the Chicago era. So, anyway, uh, basically, yeah, going back to the idea that the bourgeoisie, the owners of production, will pay you only as much as you need to literally survive. And that is sort of the minimum wage, right? So long as you can survive to run their machines, that's the wage you deserve. And so Marx and Engels also point out that the bourgeoisie will eventually move toward replacing men with women, and then women with children because they are easier to exploit and their hands are smaller, and so they're more useful. Obviously, they go on to say that there will be eventually no distinction between the quote middle class and the proletariat, right? So he sort of talks about this petty bourgeoisie, which is sort of the middle class, right? These are the artisans. These are the shop owners. They're the people who build the high quality, say, furniture and things that the elites want to buy. But they'll never have enough capital to be a bourgeoisie, right? And eventually, what Marx is saying and what was very prescient is that you'll get this sort of Walmart effect, right? All of these small mom and pop stores will not have the capital or the attorneys or whatever it may be to be able to survive. We know that one of Walmart's tactics, and often a new sort of Chinese economic tactic, is to just flood the market with the cheapest possible goods, even if you literally lose money, so that you can drive out local businesses and then raise your prices and control the market. So this is sort of the McDonald's effect. This is the Walmart effect, and this is happening all over the world. And so, Marx and Engels call it 180 years ago that this sort of thing is going to happen. And they say, quote, the lower strata of the middle class, the small tradespeople, the shopkeepers and retired tradesmen generally, the handicraftsmen and the peasants, all these sink gradually into the proletariat, partly because their diminutive capital does not suffice for the scale on which modern industry is carried on, and is swamped in the competition with large capitalists, partly because their specialized skill is rendered worthless by new methods of production. Thus, the proletariat is recruited from all classes of the population. So he's basically just trying to say here to like the laboring class, do not make a distinction between yourself and the middle class. Don't let the bourgeoisie trick you into thinking that you have different economic beliefs, right? Then he looks about sort of the stages of development of the proletariat, and he says, okay, first, you'll get this sort of incoherent lashing out against individual exploiters, right? Like arson or riots. Or so if you think of sort of the Luddite Revolution, where they're really angry about these new sort of sheep threshers and wool threshers, and they attack the factories and break the machines. But it's not really a larger movement, right? And he says that's going to be stage one. Stage two, in stage two, the proletarians will be split by the bourgeoisie by distracting them, right? So the bourgeoisie will spend their money and their political influence to split the proletariats into different groups, right? So, I mean, sort of, if you think about America right now, this is the idea that nobody wants to talk about sort of serious economics and serious economic problems quite often, but they don't even really understand them. And rather, the elites are trying to convince you that, we should be much more worried about sort of social issues, right? Like abortion and homosexuality and things of this sort. That is merely sort of smoke and mirrors so that the bourgeoisie can control the proletariat and keep them fighting each other. So a lot of times you see this with racially heterogeneous states where the very rich will have the sort of the majority and the minority or many minorities or however it's set up, sort of fighting against each other for resources rather than thinking of themselves all as, simply laborers. Okay. Stage three, as the proletariat grows, so does the bourgeoisie, right? Excuse me, as the bourgeoisie grows, so does the proletariat. And there are a couple reasons for this, right? First, more workers are needed. The bigger your factories get, generally, necessarily, the more workers you need, etc. We also have this inevitable urbanization, right? All the jobs are in the urban centers. All the culture tends to move to the urban centers. All the good schools tend to move to the urban centers. And so, as urbanization occurs, the barriers to organization and association and communication all drop, making the likelihood of a proletarian movement or a communist movement um, all the greater, right? And then finally, he says that sort of labor unions, because we're urbanizing, labor unions will form. They'll demand higher wages, and that the bourgeoisie will push back, and riots will be the inevitable consequence, right? Um, oh, yeah, okay, we'll keep going. We got a little more, then I'll stop this one. Okay. Basically, he also says that the middle classes, quote unquote, and the artisans, etc., tend to be very conservative and reactionary. And he even points out this sort of American myth. Not that he ties it to America, but he says, the middle class basically has this fake vision that they're going to be the bourgeoisie one day, that they're going to be the hyper wealthy. And so they would rather see themselves as part of the bourgeoisie than as rather than as the proletarians who don't have a lot of power, don't have a lot of money or influence, etc. And he says, quote, the lower middle class, the small manufacturer, the shopkeeper, the artisan, the peasant, all these fight against the bourgeoisie to save from extinction their existence as fractions of the middle class. They are therefore not revolutionary but conservative. Nay, more they are reactionary, for they try to roll back the wheel of history. So they are more concerned with just fighting against the bourgeoisie to stay alive than in actually tying themselves to the proletarians. And then the final point I'll close out with in this chapter, at least, is that he, Marx and Engels, they, excuse me, sort of end the chapter by saying that the breaking point of a society and the instantiation of a violent revolution is probably going to come from severe inequality. right? There's going to be a point where the straw broke the camel's back, and the people just aren't going to take it anymore. And he says, quote, the modern laborer, on the contrary, instead of rising with the process of industry, seeks deeper and deeper below the conditions of existence of his own class. He becomes a pauper, and pauperism develops more rapidly than population and wealth. And here it becomes evident that the bourgeoisie is unfit any longer to be the ruling class in society, and to impose its conditions of existence upon society as an overriding law. It is unfit to rule because it is incompetent to ensure an existence to its slave within his slavery, because it cannot help letting him sink into such a state that it has to feed him instead of being fed by him. Society can no longer live under this bourgeoisie. In other words, its existence is no longer compatible with society. And so, in some slight sense, right, this is touching on some of the things that we've read before by Plato, excuse me, Socrates, by Hobbes, and by Rousseau, who all say that there is, at least, they're not talking about the bourgeoisie and the rich, right? They're talking about the nation state. But they do say that in the social contract, the nation state has a responsibility to provide you with a decent life, right? And that if they don't, the social contract is broken. And basically, that's what Marx is saying here. He's saying, first of all, the nation state doesn't really matter anymore. What really matters is corporations. And these corporations are going to lean on you so damn hard, and they're going to try to take so much from you that um, you'll rebel. Like you just have had enough, right? The inequality has become so extraordinary that the society will no longer stand by this set of rules. So, an interesting way to close out the chapter. I'll see you for the next chapter. Have a wonderful day. Thank you for being here.